Hello.
Hello, everybody. Welcome.
To all, 7.
Oh, do you know what? I'm beginning to lose count, actually. We've got listeners coming out of our ears.
This is Factoraly.
Indeed it is.
And he's Simon Wells.
And he is Bruce Fielding.
And we are going to talk to you about facts.
So Bruce and I very much enjoy facts. We like useless information. We like researching things. We're that annoying chap in the pub who puts his hand in the air and goes, did you know?
Yes. We also like the sounds of our own voices, but that's not really surprising.
It's not surprising. No, we are both voiceover artists, and we spend a vast proportion of our time sitting in a small space talking to ourselves.
In padded spaces.
Padded spaces surrounded by expensive microphones and tech.
Yes.
And so on.
So every week we take a different subject. We've had all sorts of interesting subjects in the past. But today we're going to be talking about fish.
Well, that is a very, very different kettle of fish, isn't it? Why is it called a kettle of fish? Why a kettle?
I don't know. Why is it called a kettle of fish?
It's called a kettle of fish. So this is a copper kitchen receptacle that you lay a whole fish in. You put water in the bottom. The water boils. It steams the fish. So it's a fish kettle. It's a kettle of fish.
Yes, I've seen those.
I've never used one.
I've never used one either. But we are going to have to get to the culinary bit of fish at some point.
Yes, it's quite a big factor of the whole topic, isn't it? So let's start with them when they're still alive. So fish. The definition of the word fish is it's quite vague, but it's a creature that lives in water and breathes through gills and uses fins and a tail for swimming. So that could apply to quite a lot of creatures. Yes. And the etymology of the word fish comes from the Latin word piscis, which gives us the star sign Pisces. It gives us the French word poisson. Even indirectly, it gives us the word porpoise.
And pescatarians.
Pescatarians. And it gives us fish, which obviously sounds nothing like it. But we are English, and we change and we morph, and we end up with, I guess,
unless it starts with PH or something.
Now, fish is a bit of a sticky topic in some circles. Some would claim that there is no such thing as a fish.
I've heard this.
Which, apart from being the title of a podcast, which both of us enjoy listening to.
Definitely.
It is a scientific debate that goes on that this term fish is just so broad. And all of the creatures that we used to just call a type of fish have been classified, reclassified, given very, very technical scientific names, until there's such a point now where there's no real need scientifically for the word fish. I mean, when the word fish applies to creatures so diverse as a starfish, a jellyfish, a crayfish, shellfish.
Can I just stop you there?
You may.
A jellyfish isn't a fish.
Well, precisely.
Neither is a starfish.
No.
And neither is a crayfish.
No. Exactly. That's the point. That there are so many. The word fish, going back to about the 14th century, the word fish was a generic word for pretty much any animal that lived in the sea.
But a seahorse is a fish, even though it's not a horse.
Hang on a second, Bruce. What are you saying?
There are horses that are fish, but there's jelly that isn't.
Great. Yep, fine. So you can see why scientists don't really like using the word, because it's a bit vague and it's a bit broad and it's not specific enough, which has led to some scientists saying there is no creature that you can point at and say that is a fish and nothing else. Therefore, fish don't exist.
But if they did exist, there would be a lot of them.
Yes. Do you know how many?
How many fish in the sea? I know there are always plenty more. But I think there are about sort of 30,000 varieties of fish or something.
That's a lot, isn't it?
It's an awful lot of fish.
And of that 30,000 different types of fish around the world, do you know how many different species we have around the UK coasts?
I have no idea.
Just 300.
So where are the other 29,700 living?
Elsewhere. This planet has quite a lot of water on it, so there is an awful lot of space for those fish, if indeed they are fish, to live.
Well, technically, I guess they live in a bigger environment than the environment that we live in, because not only are they sort of just the surface area, they also go down quite a long way as well.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, they've got a lot more. I was going to say they've got a lot more ground to cover, but that's completely the point. They don't. They have a lot more water to cover than we have ground to cover.
They do. They do. And you see them in like vast numbers in some places and then none at all in others.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're so diverse in terms of their size, shape, colour, physiology, everything.
Yeah, some of those deep sea fish look really weird.
They do, don't they? Yes. There are species of fish that have become blind over the generations because they live in such dark places that they've evolved to not need their eyes. But
generally, I think fish have really good senses, don't they? They can hear really well, they can see really well, and smell really well.
Yes. That old thing about a shark being able to smell one drop of blood in 100 gallons or whatever it is of water.
Yes,
is quite impressive.
Very.
And sharks, of course, come under the.
They're fish.
They are fish. They are fish. Whales are not, because whales are mammals.
Which is defined as?
Something different.
I think it has to give birth to live young.
Rather than
and
eggs.
Then suckle.
That seems reasonable.
Yes.
So whales are not fish. But the whale shark is a fish. Yeah, I know. It's a headache. And the whale shark is, in fact, the biggest fish.
Hey.
In the world. Whale sharks have been known on occasion to grow up to 18 meters in length from tip of the nose to the tip of the tail.
That's quite big. If I saw one of those coming, I would worry.
So that's the largest fish, the whale shark. By contrast, the world's smallest fish is really difficult to pronounce.
So we're going to try.
I'm going to try anyway. It's called the Pedocyprus progenetica.
Wow.
You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay. So we've done the big fish, the little fish. What we should really do now.
Something about cardboard boxes. Yeah, absolutely. And this little fish, this Pedocyprus progenetica, is roughly 10 millimeters in length.
So less than half an inch.
It's about a fingernail. And these are found off the coast of Sumatra and the UK. I didn't realise this. Did you know fish don't have eyelids?
Ah, so they can never blink.
Sorry, most fish don't have eyelids. Sharks, for some reason, do. But the vast majority of fish don't have eyelids.
So never enter a staring competition.
Never enter a staring competition with a fish. And this is because eyelids, in land-living creatures such as ourselves, eyelids are there to moisten the eyes. And what with living in water, fish's eyes are moist the whole time, and therefore they don't need eyelids.
Well,
that never occurred to me.
That never occurred to me either.
Well, there you go.
That's amazing. So, no eyelids.
No eyelids.
And lay eggs.
They lay eggs, yes. They breathe through gills. Do you know much about gills?
I don't.
So gills are they are sort of a fibrous strand-like organ. They sort of look a bit like the strings of a harp, and they sit just under the flank, the side of the fish, and the fish takes a large mouthful of oxygen-rich water. It passes over the gills, and the gills have blood running through them. And by some form of osmosis, the oxygen from the water seeps into the bloodstream, circulates around the fish, and then the water that's just had the oxygen removed from it is passed out through a small hole behind the gills back into the water.
Wow.
There you go.
And that can be seawater or freshwater, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, there are different species of fish that prefer to live in one or t'other. But the principle is the same. I don't know how the saltiness or lack thereof affects that process.
No, I wouldn't.
If at all.
I can't work it out either, but maybe you get saltier air.
Maybe you do get saltier air. If anyone knows the answer to that, drop it in the comments.
It's what the comments are for.
We love learning as much as we love boring the pants off everyone we know with this trivia. So if you know something we don't know, please tell us.
There are fish that can, like talking of like a fish out of water. There are actually fish that can survive for short periods out of water.
Are there?
There's a fish called a mud skipper
that
can actually sort of walk on its fins from place to place, like from one body of water to another body of water on land.
Really?
And it kind of like, it holds water in itself. It's almost like wearing an astronaut suit full of air. It kind of wears an astronaut suit full of water, and it just holds this water in and re-oxygenates while walking across land. Mud skippers.
Brilliant.
Weird things.
Huh, interesting. And then there's the flying variety of fish.
Yes.
Which don't fly.
No.
But they swim very, very fast up and out of the water. Their fins look vaguely wing-like.
They do sort of glide a bit.
They glide a bit, but not much. And then plop back down into the water again.
Yes. But they look lovely when you're on a boat and you see a whole shoal of flying fish coming past you. Shoals are interesting, actually.
I was just going to say, you've just said the word shoal. Is there a difference between a shoal and a school?
Ooh.
Because fish gather in both. Is it just a mispronunciation?
I think it's probably just British people. You know how we sort of like anglicize words?
We do that.
It's probably officially a shoal.
Yes.
And
officially.
Somebody English
officially.
Somebody English said, I can't be bothered to pronounce shoal. Let's call it a school.
School. Sounds a bit like school. I know the word school. That works. Yeah.
So, but they're defensive generally, aren't they, shoals?
They are, yes. So the point of a shoal is that they exist for the greater good. What's the word for it? Sort of herd immunity. If a predator is going after a single fish, it will win. If a predator goes after a shoal of several hundred fish, it might only capture a couple of them, and the majority is kept safe. So it's a form of protection in groups, safety in numbers. And the way that the shoal of fish move around, it sort of confuses the predator into thinking that it's one entity rather than hundreds.
So you see
together.
A dirty great thing coming at you. And
Yeah.
you go, I think I'm not going to tangle with this.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you sort of see footage of a shoal of fish suddenly moving, changing direction, and the way they reflect light, that's one of the purposes of a fish having scales. So the scales of a fish help to protect it a little bit like armor. They help to make it more aquadynamic. Is that the watery equivalent of aerodynamic? It is. Yes. Helps them swim faster.
And they can really go for it, actually. Tuna, I think, goes about 70 k, so about sort of 45 miles an hour. Yeah.
That's quick, isn't it?
That's very quick.
Gosh.
But the scales thing's interesting because people have found uses for scales. If you ever see somebody in lipstick, the likelihood is that they are wearing fish scales.
Right.
Because they use a lot of fish scales in lipstick to make it shiny.
Do they?
Glittery.
Huh.
But we do use bits of fish for all sorts of interesting things. My favourite thing, which I discovered only recently, is that because fish live generally in cold places. I mean, the sea is cold, and the deeper you go, the colder it gets.
Yeah.
And generally it's below sort of freezing.
Yeah.
And because it's salt water, it doesn't freeze at freezing point. It freezes lower than freezing point. But the fish have to defend their blood from freezing. You don't want your blood to freeze.
No,
so fish have actually developed an ice structuring protein which stops their blood from freezing.
Interesting.
And Unilever have actually decided that it's a really good idea to take a clone of this protein and use it in the manufacture of ice cream. Because if you use it in ice cream doesn't then melt at quite such high. It actually melts at a lower temperature because it's using this protein. So if you've got your Magnum or your Cornetto or something, the reason why it doesn't just melt and go all over your fingers immediately is because it's got this protein in it that keeps it icy and cold for longer.
Well, I never knew that.
There's lots of other things we don't know about. I mean, fish are weird because we know quite a lot about fish, generally from catching them and eating them. But there are certain things that we don't know that human beings have spent a lot of money on finding out where eels come from. And eels are so fascinating. Eels, especially European eels. European eels are wild.
Right.
I could do a whole episode on eels. They are so good. For years and years, since the Greeks, since Aristotle and Pliny and that lot, eels have been fascinating people because they don't appear to have any reproductive organs, and yet there's always eels.
Oh, okay.
So how does that happen?
Magic.
And where do eels breed? It was believed that, they were magic, or that the way that eels bred was that they scraped against rocks and bits of eel would turn into fresh eels.
Okay.
There was all sorts of beliefs about eels, and they had magic powers, and you could wear a coat of eel skin, and that would protect you from the dark forces. And there's all this wild stuff about eels. And it was only kind of reasonably recently that people started to go, well, actually, where do eels come from? And it was the mission in life of a guy who was Danish. I mean, the Danes eat a lot of eels.
Right, okay.
And this Danish guy was so passionate about it, he spent every penny he had trying to find where eels went to breed. And then he got married to his boss's daughter.
Right.
And given that he worked at the Carlsberg brewery, his boss had quite a lot of money.
Well,
and
naturally.
so did the boss's daughter. So he spent millions. But whenever you have a bottle of Carlsberg, think of an eel, because that's where a lot of the money went, was to find the source of the eels. And where he managed to track them to was the Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic. This is a sea within a sea. And the Sargasso Sea is about the size of Germany, France, and the UK combined. It's huge.
Crikey, that's a lot of water.
Sea. And so mapping it to try and find out the exact spot where eels went to breed was practically impossible. And eels also have a weird life because they change from being these little sort of like centimetre long things to, this is European eels.
Right.
To then they become an invisible fish. They're sort of like these translucent fish.
Oh, really?
And then they go from translucent fish into sort of like a yellow eel. And that's when they're sort of growing up. And then they eat everything they can until they get to the point where it's time to go and spawn again. And then they turn into these silver things, which then go back to the Sargasso Sea. And they haven't at this point got any reproductive organs. But on the swim back from Europe to the Sargasso Sea, they grow organs. That's when they grow all the bits that you need to reproduce.
Incredible. So they spend however much of their life it is genderless, and it's only on their way back to reproduce that they suddenly start growing the reproductive organs to do the job.
Yes, and this is why they were so popular amongst ancient Greeks and people in medieval times, is because they were seen as pure. They were seen as something which was not led by their sexual desires. They had no sexual desires because they had no sex.
Yes, sure. And whenever I think of eels, I always sort of think of the fens, around sort of Cambridgeshire going into East Anglia.
Yes.
And the mysticism and the eeriness that is represented by that place. So I suppose that sort of goes hand in hand with that landscape, doesn't it?
It does. And they are amazing. I mean, they are huge. They used to be food that was everywhere, and it was very cheap. They're now one of the most expensive foods you can buy.
Really?
Which has meant that there is a massive trade in illegal eel smuggling.
Illegal eel. Now, that's
illegal eel.
That's a good tongue twister for the day, isn't it?
So this illegal trade in European eels is worth about £2.5 billion a year.
No.
Yes. And people smuggle them in from Europe into Japan in suitcases, in crates, in whatever they can find. It's so valuable to have eels. Wow. They're one of the most valuable things you can smuggle sort of after drugs.
And yet, I think of eels as being a very common food, sort of the preserve of East Londoners for generations,
They were, but now
eels and eel pies and things.
Well, one of the things that's happening is because the smugglers are culling the young eels and not letting them get back to the Sargasso Sea to breed, they're becoming more and more rare. Although,
interesting,
now that they know about this smuggling trade, they're cracking down on it, so that the eel population is rising again. But it was shrinking quite significantly because of this eel smuggling.
Wow. Do you know what a young eel is called?
I do, but tell me.
It's called an elver. Isn't that lovely? That's a nice word, elver.
Elver's great. The Latin name for an eel is Anguilla anguilla.
Right.
Eels are also, they're very long-lived. They can live up to 80 years.
Wow.
They can live, obviously they get eaten and what have you.
Yes, sure.
All sorts of shenanigans. Yeah. They can switch from being freshwater to seawater.
Okay.
They come as little as 5 millimeters long and as long as 3 meters.
Oh my goodness.
So a decent sized moray eel is 9 foot long and weighs about the same as me. And I'm not small.
That's impressive, isn't it?
I know. It's just a massive, there's something like 800 species of eel.
Crikey.
We talked about, how many species of fish there are. Of those species, 800 of them are eels.
Who'd have thought? I picture an eel and I picture a moray or a conger, I guess.
Yes.
And that's about it.
They all work in terms of the way that they hunt. They all hunt the same way, which is they basically hide and then leap out at fish and crustaceans and stuff.
Yes.
And I've had a moray eel leap out at me. That's quite frightening when you're scuba diving.
Ooh,
but
nasty.
Yeah, you want to stay away from the morays.
Oh, with my fear of snakes, I think eels are a little bit too close to snakes for my liking.
Yes, the way they swim is quite. They swim in the same way that snakes move, which is they sort of undulate, which creates a wave in the water, which propels them forward. But an eel can go as fast backwards as it can forwards, because it just has to undulate the other way.
Does it the other way? Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I have to say that researching eels has been very, very enlightening. I'm now fascinated by eels.
I think you've made more out of the eel section of this than the whole of the rest of the fish section. You've suddenly come to life whilst talking about eels.
No one has ever found a European eel egg in the wild, ever.
Really?
Yeah. You can farm them. You can take you can take the eels out of the sea and put them into a farm.
Yeah.
And you can have farmed eels, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But
no one's ever found a wild egg.
No.
Wow. God, slippery little things.
Well, you say that they were cheap food, but actually, in medieval times, you could use eels to pay your taxes. They were so valuable.
Really?
So dried eels were used to pay taxes. There was a case in medieval Britain. A village had to pay the guy who owned the village, the earl.
Yes.
I think it was 75,000 eels was an annual rent for the village.
Wow. That's quite a large tank of eels, isn't it?
That is a lot. Well, they were tried, so I guess you can spend the year catching them and drying them or whatever, and then give them to the lord of the manor as your rent fee.
I'm purely hypothesizing right now, but having mentioned the fens of Cambridgeshire, I wonder if there's a connection between the word eel and the city of Ely.
Ah.
Do you suppose Ely is named after the fact that there are lots of eels nearby?
Could do. I don't know.
Let's say it is. If anyone can confirm or deny that, please drop it in the comments.
That's what the comments are for. Yes, and we'll probably find that there's a lot of people who are into eels who comment hugely on the fact that I'm wrong about most of this stuff.
Which we welcome.
Yes.
We're not experts. We're just two chaps having a natter like you would down the pub, getting it wrong.
About fish.
Exactly.
Which we knew very little about until we started to do some research.
Now we know a lot more.
Apart from the fact they were delicious.
Yes.
We could talk about dangerous fish.
Oh, go on then.
In fact, the eel is also poisonous.
Is it?
It'll send you into anaphylactic shock if you eat raw eel.
Oh.
because it has a toxin in it, which is the toxin is eliminated by cooking.
Oh, okay. Right.
So a cooked eel, not a problem. Raw eel.
So it's there to put predators off.
Yes, exactly.
Biting into it.
Yeah, so that's not a nice thing to eat. But there are also things like lionfish, which are hugely poisonous, and stonefish, which are even more poisonous, that live more in the sort of like the warmer waters of the Caribbean and Indian Ocean.
And jellyfish, which aren't fish.
That's true. Have you ever been stung by jellyfish?
I haven't, but I've heard it's not comfortable.
So we don't know very much about fish at all, but there are some fish that we know quite a lot about, generally because we eat them. And one of those is salmon.
Right, okay.
And there's lots of different types of salmon. There's chum and pink and chinook and sockeye and coho. But they all have this thing where they return to where they were born. Yes. To spawn again.
Yes. We both live fairly close to the River Thames in different areas of it, but quite close to the River Thames. And in my neck of the woods, there are a series of what they call salmon leaps installed, which are sort of, I guess they're kind of like staircases with water running over them that help the salmon to go around locks and weirs and things in their journey back upstream to where they come from in order to breed. So we've moved on from the live ones to the dead ones, which we consume, as a nice little transition. I started looking at how much fish do we consume, where does our fish come from, all that sort of stuff, without getting too political or anything. The majority of the fish that we catch around British shores is sold off to elsewhere, mostly to the EU. And the majority of fish that we eat in the UK comes from elsewhere, largely Sweden, Denmark, and Germany. I don't know why that is, but it's an interesting thing.
Yes. I think that the Norwegians have actually been quite clever about the use of their fish, because their fish generally don't have parasites. And in fact, there was a very clever, I think he was Norwegian, salesman who went to Japan and tasted some of their sushi and went, oh, this is nice. And they said, oh, that's the hardest. We never really have salmon sushi because there's so many parasites in salmon that it's impossible to make it into really good sushi. And the Norwegian guy said, Norwegian salmon doesn't have parasites.
Really?
And the Japanese went, this is very interesting. Huh. And from that conversation, something like 20% of all Norwegian salmon is shipped to Japan.
Wow.
And it's now quite common to see salmon in sushi, whereas a few years ago, it actually wasn't.
So yes, eating fish. In the UK, we have over 10,000 fish and chip shops. We spend £1.2 billion a year at fish and chip shops, and we consume a rough number of 167 million meals of fish and chips per year in this country.
I think that sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
And so that's me. What about you?
My local chippy here in Shepperton has a sign outside it saying Fish Friday, which I didn't used to think anything of. It's a nice bit of alliteration.
Yep.
You can have fish any day of the week, obviously. But the more I've thought about it, the more I realised Fish Friday is actually a thing, that people frequently eat fish on a Friday. And I hadn't really realised this. I just thought it was a marketing ploy by the fish and chip shop. But I started looking into it, and it turns out it is a Christian thing, because in the Christian faith, Jesus was killed on Good Friday. And out of a mark of respect, early Christians decided not to eat meat of warm-blooded animals on a Friday, which left them rather conveniently open to cold-blooded animals. So they started eating fish on a Friday. And this has just carried on. It's sort of become a tradition, particularly in the Catholic world. When Henry VIII had his little bit of a tiff with the Roman Catholic Church, he decided to completely abolish that. This is a popish dish to eat fish on a Friday. We're going to scrap that altogether. So he stopped fish fasting by a matter of law. And it wasn't until his son Edward took over that Fish Fridays came back into place, and they've been there ever since.
Aha.
Now, another area of fish that I had a little bit of a look into was pet fish.
Aha, yes, the tank.
The tank, the fish tank, or the fish bowl. So we as a nation appear to be quite keen on keeping fish. I've never owned one. I've never seen the attraction of it. But apparently this country, 4 million UK households own a pet fish.
Is that probably goldfish that they want at the fair or something?
Well, quite possibly, but it also includes tropical fish, which are a really serious thing these days. Buying the equipment, the tank, the filtration systems, the correct food, identifying which fish is right for your environment, and so on and so on. It's quite a big industry, and we spend, apparently, as a nation, we spend £400 to £500 million a year on pet fish ownership.
Goodness me.
Something I found out about goldfish is that their size is dependent on their environment.
Ah, so if you have one in a fish bowl, it's never going to grow out. It's never going to outgrow the fish bowl. Precisely.
If you release a goldfish, it will grow. And quite a few goldfish have been released. As you say, the goldfish has been purchased at the fair or given as a birthday present. The novelty is worn off. The fish has been ceremonially released by flushing it down the toilet. And
they're not always dead,
Precisely.
When they're
they're
floating.
Not. Yeah.
Because they have a float bladder.
Okay.
And if they get an infected float bladder, they float.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not actually dead. So sometimes you'll see a fish that's kind of got an infection.
Right.
And you're going, oh, poor thing. Flush it down the toilet, give it a Viking funeral, and
then it suddenly recovers.
And and wherever it gets to, it's going to recover or die.
Right,
because those infections, those float bladder infections can be fatal.
Well, apparently the ones that don't die of the bladder infections, the ones that are released and let out into the wild, they seem to do quite well when they're not confined by the goldfish bowl. They can reach up to 2 feet long
in the sewers.
Sewers, which eventually lead out to rivers.
Wow.
They can be quite dangerous in the wild because they eat a lot of things and they can ruin the biodiversity of the local area.
Goodness me.
So don't release your goldfish, Bruce.
Or if you do release it into the ground rather than into the water.
Yes. And on the subject of goldfish, we all know the wonderful fact that goldfish only have a memory of 3 seconds.
And is that true?
No, it's not. It's not at all. Again, maybe whilst they're swimming around in their bowl looking a little bit gormless, perhaps it's sort of understandable. But an American student, as part of her second year university studies, did an experiment with her pet goldfish. And she created a little maze to put in the fish tank. And she encouraged, by way of putting food here and there, she encouraged her goldfish to swim through the maze in a particular way. And doing this over a period of time, she found that this goldfish had a memory of up to a month. Because after a month, it was still going the same route through the maze, even after she'd taken away the treats. So that whole thing of the 3-second memory is not necessarily true, unless she just had a very intelligent goldfish.
So this thing about goldfish not having a good memory, is that true?
Well, no, it's not actually, because there was a student who, hang on, we've been here before.
I think that's a brilliant place to stop fishing.
I think it is. I think it's high time we stop carping on about all of this stuff.
Oh, dear. Are we in the right place, though?
Oh, nice. Well, there we go then. So thank you to all of our listeners.
And don't forget to do the usual bits and pieces, which are, Simon?
Clicking, liking, subscribing, commenting, telling other people. You can even visit our website at www.factoraly.com, where you can find all of our previous episodes ready for you to listen to at your leisure.
Marvellous. So thank you very much for listening.
See you all next time.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.